Eventually, Shane Beamer's going to have to make a final decision regarding how he wants to handle his coaching staff this offseason. But no matter what decision he makes, there's going to be inherent risk included.
You are Locked On Gamecocks, your daily podcast on the South Carolina Gamecocks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, Gamecock Nation, and welcome back to the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. I'm Andrew Lyon, the host of this podcast, and also a staff writer for Gamecock Digest over on SI.com. Thank y'all so much for making the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your first listen or watch for your team here today. We are free and available, as always, both on YouTube and wherever you get your audio podcasts daily. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more right now, as new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 money line bet. That's $150 if your team wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. When South Carolina's 2023 football season concluded, Shane Beamer immediately had a checklist that he had to go through. A couple of those items regarded his roster, figuring out who all was going to come back for next year, trying to keep some of his players here in the locker room for the 2024 season. And then it was trying to add pieces to the transfer portal. Then it was trying to make sure that he kept this pivotal 2024 recruiting class intact, which, by the way, we're going to discuss in a little bit more detail later on the show with Locked On recruiting insider Brian Smith. But another thing that Shane Beamer is going to have to eventually do is he's going to have to make a final decision regarding all of his assistants on his coaching staff. And typically, when a team has a losing season, there's usually some sort of change to a certain degree. But no matter what Shane Beamer decides to do, whether or not it's keeping his entire staff intact or getting rid of some guys, he's going to be taking a risk heading into the 2024 season. Before we dive into those two risks, I want to play a quick clip and soundbite of what Shane Beamer said regarding this topic when he held his presser during the early National Signing Day period 2 Wednesdays ago.
Coaching staff, will it be status quo moving forward, or do you foresee anything happening there?
Those are things that we're continuing to look at and evaluate. I've had some conversations with some people already, and our focus this month has been recruiting, Phil, and that's what it is right now. But, you know, as I said at the beginning, it's my job as the head coach to always look at everything that we're doing from top to bottom, starting with me. And if there's ways to be better, certainly being willing to make those decisions. So those are all things that we're still going through.
So obviously in that clip and soundbite, Shane Beamer doesn't really indicate too much where he's leaning in terms of his decision-making process, and that's to be expected. But at the end of that answer, he gave off the impression, at least to a certain degree, that he's a bit conflicted emotionally, which is also somewhat expected because admittedly it's not an enviable position that Shane Beamer's in right now, because he's got multiple guys that rely on him for their livelihood and their yearly paychecks and being able to provide for their families. But again, as I mentioned earlier, Shane Beamer, no matter what route he decides to go down, there's going to be inherent risk involved. So let's go over the first scenario and the first sort of risk factor here. Let's say Shane Beamer brings every single one of his assistants back for the 2024 season, or maybe he only lets go of, say, one, maybe two. The pressure to deliver on-field results, better on-field results this next fall, which would probably have to be 6 or more wins, would be a lot greater if he decides to go down this route. The risk here is if that does not happen. If Shane Beamer, let's say, wins 5 games or maybe 4 games, or gosh forbid the bottom falls out for South Carolina this next season and they win, say, 3 games or less, he will effectively lose the entire fan base, or at least the majority of the fan base. He will likely lose the support of a decent percentage of South Carolina's donor base, and he would either lose his job or he would go into the 2025 season, or in this case, the 2024 offseason, with a scorching hot seat. And he would likely be forced to make changes no matter what he did this offseason, hoping that it would provide immediate positive results on the field the following year. A lot of people would say, hey, if you're going to have to make changes at some point in time, now would be the time to do it. And yes, there would be risk involved with that as well. If Shane Beamer decides to move on from multiple on-field assistants and bring in some new blood, there's going to be an issue when it comes to the relationship and rapport some of these players have with their respective coaches, whether it be, say, a position coach or maybe a coordinator. These coaches would have to spend more time in that regard this offseason with these players. And that's not to say it would take away a ton of time in terms of being able to teach these players on technique on the field, maybe new plays in a playbook, etc. But it is something to keep in mind. Now, for this risk, let's be even more specific here. Let's say Shane Beamer makes the decision to part ways with Clayton White. You be bringing in a new coach that likely has their own scheme, and at the very least, their own terminology in the way that they like to run things. That new coordinator would also like to probably bring in some of his own guys, some of his own assistants that know his system to the nth degree. And that would mean that if you're Shane Beamer and you find yourself in that situation, you would probably have to move on from a couple of other on-field defensive coaches. And who would that be? Are you going to move on from a Torian Gray? I highly doubt that'd be the case. Torian Gray's been probably one of your better assistant coaches on this staff since you've arrived here. You just literally brought in Travian Robertson, and Travian Robertson, from what all has been said, he's brought a newfound intensity to the defensive line unit. Sterling Lucas, the edge rusher / outside linebackers coach. He's been probably one of your best recruiters on the entire staff. He's a big reason why you just brought in a guy like Dylan Stewart. So you could see where Shane Beamer would have an epiphany here with this entire thought process. Because I don't think Shane Beamer wants to fire one guy and then have to turn around and fire multiple other guys that, quite frankly, he doesn't want to move on from. Because he's got a pretty deep relationship, especially with Torian Gray and Travian Robertson. Robertson, of course, was a player here when Shane Beamer was an assistant coach in Columbia in his first go-round. And Torian Gray, he has known Shane Beamer since their days at Virginia Tech. So, the whole point of this conversation is to pretty much emphasize that no matter what Shane Beamer does, and no matter what your thoughts are on what he should do, and I think we've all pretty much made our thoughts known by this point in the year, Shane Beamer is going to be taking a chance. But when you go 5-7 in your third season, an obvious down year, and the rest of the conference is only getting stronger when you look at the majority of those programs, you have no choice but to take a chance. The question is, what kind of chance or what kind of risk, in this case, is Shane Beamer willing to take? We'll probably find out the answer to that question as the next few weeks progress. Now, I said earlier that we're going to bring on Locked On's resident recruiting insider Brian Smith to discuss a bevy of different topics with South Carolina's 2024 class that they just signed for the most part during the early national signing period. We'll discuss that and a little bit more in just a couple moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. As the weather gets colder, the NFL offers are staying hot on FanDuel. Right now, new customers on FanDuel can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 money line bet. That's $150, again, if your team wins. We got some Thursday night football taking place later tonight between the New York Jets and the Cleveland Browns. The Jets are going to be the ones on the road in this matchup, and they've just struggled mightily the past few weeks, and the Browns, they've been doing the exact opposite. They have really taken off as a team collectively. That defense is great, and Joe Flacco, he's been playing like the Joe Flacco that played in Baltimore several years ago. So the money line for the Jets is set at plus 275. The money line for the Browns, minus 340. If you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there's no better time to get in on the action. The app is easy to use, and you can bet on everything from spreads to player props and more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and kick off the NFL season with FanDuel, an official partner of the NFL. Welcome back to this Thursday edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your South Carolina Gamecocks every single day. And as always, a big thank you to each and every one of you everydayers who make the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your daily choice for South Carolina Gamecock sports coverage. We are joined by Locked On's resident recruiting insider, Brian Smith, who's about to give us some of his impressions on the 2024 class. Who's maybe the most underrated? Which group did South Carolina need to hit a little bit harder in this cycle? And some thoughts on the transfer portal and National Signing Day. We're going to touch on all of that in the next few moments. But before we do that, I want to let y'all know this recruiting segment is brought to you and sponsored by LinkedIn Jobs. Because these days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. And that's why LinkedIn Jobs helps find the right people for your team faster and for free. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. Terms and conditions do apply. All right, Brian, we've been through all the hoopla with the early National Signing Day period. I can imagine you were quite busy with everything that was going on this past week. All these schools, some of these commitments still going down to the wire. And South Carolina, from a ranking standpoint, finished out with another solid recruiting class, a top 20 class, depending on where you look for Shane Beamer and company. When you take a look at this class, what's your overall impression of this group that they're bringing in?
They increased their speed. They increased their length, especially offensive tackle, defensive end. Obviously, Dylan playing on the edge. He was my favorite edge defender in the country. I think that overall, the top end is really good, especially by historical South Carolina standards. And I think they also have some guys that might surprise a few people, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And maybe a little light in the pants at a couple of spots, and we'll also talk about that. But overall, to be honest, this is better than what South Carolina usually does.
Yeah, without a question. There was definitely a couple position groups that they hit really well, one of them being the offensive line, and that group is headlined by five-star offensive tackle in South Carolina native Josiah Thompson, and you pair him up with Dylan Stewart. Those were the top two guys in this recruiting class for Shane Beamer and this staff. So, Brian, when you take a look at both of these prospects, which five-star signee do you think has the higher ceiling and why?
Ceiling, you could argue either way. You might say Thompson because offensive tackles hit more. It just takes longer. He might be the better pro player, but talking about college, I'll take Dylan 100 out of 100 because he can walk in and play right away. He can edge rush right now, 3rd and 6. You can point him out, but can you block him? It's more about natural skill being on the edge than his tackle. Offensive tackle is technique times 100. So I think they're both great players, but I'll take Stewart at least short term for sure. Thompson might catch him long term when he gets to the NFL, but Dylan Stewart is a freakazoid.
Yeah, and Dylan Stewart, he will probably be a guy that is going to be starting from day one as soon as he gets on campus here in Columbia. And Josiah Thompson, you mentioned that it usually takes offensive linemen a little bit longer, even the 5-stars, to get adjusted to the college game. Brian, if you had to give sort of a timeline, maybe how long you think Josiah Thompson might take until he's ready, how long were you thinking? Are we thinking, maybe 2 years, 2.5 seasons? What's your thoughts on that?
I think year 2. I mean, he might start by the end of his freshman year or play, but there are a couple components with that. Number one, how many guys do you get in the portal between now and next August? Because we got another portal season at the end of April.
Right.
Like mid-April to end. Maybe they get lucky and they get a tackle and they can move Josiah to guard his freshman year. That's what Saban does a lot of times with the Bama kids, and they'll move out as they gain more experience. I hope he doesn't have to go play left tackle, for the love of God, right off the bat. That's terrible at the SEC level. Bama did that this year, and their big stud offensive tackle that got out of Iowa, everybody destroyed him early in the year. He got beat around pretty good. But this kid, by the end of his freshman year, Thompson's got to play some, right? I mean, it's not like South Carolina's got a top 5 O-line in the country. So you got to find a way to get him on the field at least a little bit. And the other part is, how complex is the scheme going to be next year? Who's the quarterback going to be? How much comfort do you have with that? So there's a lot of moving parts.
Yeah, and especially considering the loss of Jalen Nichols to the transfer portal for South Carolina, Gamecock fans are going to certainly be hoping that Josiah Thompson, won't have to go out there immediately, but, you'd rather have him ready sooner rather than later. All right, Brian, going back and looking at this class, obviously, if you're a program like South Carolina, again, you could sign some real heavy hitters that obviously, the guys like Dylan Stewart and Josiah Thompson. But for the Gamecocks, if they want to compete in the SEC, they've also got to land some kids that, might be flying a bit under the radar. So when you look at this class, Brian, who's the most underrated prospect out of this entire group?
I would say DeBron Gatling. He's a kid that was committed to A&M for a long time. He played at Milton High School. They just won a state championship. He's a big play receiver, and he's just smooth as it can get. I've known him since he was a freshman. He played on Cam Newton's 7-on-7 program, and he was the guy. And to be the guy at that program that they throw to puts it in perspective. And then, as he came up, became a recruit, and he kind of faded away because he committed A&M so early. But I'm telling you, he has a chance to play rather early because he's a route runner and he's an easy kid to coach. He'll figure it out, and he'll make some moves before the end of his freshman year.
Yeah, considering all the scholarship wide receivers that the Gamecocks have lost to the transfer portal so far this offseason, especially from a numbers standpoint, Gatling, another guy, you're probably going to hope that he's ready to play pretty much immediately, at least in that rotational aspect in 2024. And Brian, of course, unless you're a school like Alabama or Georgia, usually you're going to have an area or two where you're going to look back and you're going to be like, we probably could have done a little bit better in this spot. For South Carolina, what is that position group for them in this cycle?
Look, again, I love Dylan Stewart. Don't get it twisted. But where are the numbers? You can never have a two-man defensive line class in the Southeastern Conference. And they just did. They needed at least one more, and I'd prefer two. I like to get 4 every year, 2 edge, 2 interior. They didn't do it. Now, that's not to say this is a different era, and I'm just looking at it from a high school signing day kind of deal. They could get somebody from the portal, or maybe they thought they were going to get somebody and that changed things. But when you don't win in the trenches and recruiting in the Southeastern Conference, it does not end well for you on Saturday nights, regardless you're home or away. So I would have liked to have seen at least one more.
Yeah, and Brian, I went back and looked at the class breakdown for the interior defensive linemen specifically about a week or so ago. And South Carolina this next season, they will not have any first or second year players along the interior defensive line. I've never seen anything like that in the trenches for South Carolina for all the years that I've watched the Gamecocks play. So, yeah, you're absolutely right. They're going to be in dire straits next year if they do not get things figured out there quickly. You're probably going to have to put a lot of effort towards getting Elijah Griffin out of Savannah, Georgia. But obviously the Bulldogs, they're also going to have something to say about that, considering that he is in their state. So those are Brian's thoughts on the 2024 recruiting class. But Brian's also got some thoughts regarding National Signing Day and how the transfer portal has maybe tampered down some of the excitement surrounding the event. We're going to dive into that topic in just a couple moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Welcome back to today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your team every single day in just 30 minutes. All right, Brian, I want to switch gears from South Carolina's 2024 signing class. I want to ask you about the early National Signing Day period, which took place last week, because, Brian, I got to be honest with you. Obviously, years back, signing day used to mean something a lot more than it probably means now. And with the transfer portal era that we are now in, it kind of feels like that the excitement around National Signing Day, or the early National Signing Day period even, has kind of been lessened to a significant degree. What are your thoughts on that? And, I know that it's not a simple fix, but is there any way to try to solve that problem?
It is one of the more complex deals that I know of. The NCAA, who I do not like very much, is in a bit of a pickle in this one, because the end of the semester, you need to have the portal open then because kids aren't in class. Makes sense. Or they're about to not be. Well, that just happens to coincide when the high school kids are done too. And that merger, bowl games, and think about this. In 1 year, you've got the freaking playoff starting, going right up into, like, how the hell does a coach have a playoff game? And then on the Wednesday of that week or whatever, you got National Signing Day. I have no idea how you fix that, because especially some of these, like O-line takes longer to develop. You need to see senior film. Like running back, receiver, there's some of those skill, that's different, but like O-line, quarterback, etc. man, they need those senior reps. And some guys get scholarships that I didn't even know about because they balled out as seniors. I don't see a good fix here. I've seen a lot of people bitch, but I haven't seen one good solution. And there may not be. That's the problem. So I don't know what you do. But like, look, if I'm a coach that's like, let's say Michigan is who I draw next year in the playoff. Oh boy, that's going to be fun. And now let's go and try to recruit the last 3-4 days before that game and finish our recruiting class. How the hell would you, like, signing day press conferences are like 1-2 o'clock. That's what time you're usually getting ready to walk out on your practice field. And you got Michigan on Saturday or whatever. Come on. That's not a good combination. I don't know what you do.
Yeah, and then you talk about these playoff teams, you throw in the fact that, some of the backups on those teams, some important backups, with the transfer portal, the way it's set up right now, they don't really have a choice but to go ahead and enter. I mean, Malik Murphy's a great example for Texas. If Quinn Ewers
100%.
goes down in their playoff game against Washington in just a few days,
guess
Texas
who's in?
is in a heap of trouble. I mean, Steve Sarkisian is a masterful offensive mind, no doubt about that, but no one can coach around having a third string quarterback possibly having to go into the football game. It's the calendar's all screwed up. We all know it, except for the people that seem to have the most power to possibly change all of that. So it's quite unfortunate. And obviously with National Signing Day, I'm with you. I don't know if it's you move it to August per se, and you put in a stipulation where you allow kids to, look around if a coach gets fired. I don't know what the solution is myself. So I'm just glad again that I'm not the person that's got to figure out that potential solution to that problem. So, but Brian, I thank you so much for coming on to today's show and giving us all of your thoughts on South Carolina's 2024 recruiting class and also what all, is going on with the portal and early National Signing Day. For all the folks that are interested in looking at more recruiting information, where can they find your work?
At FBScout_Florida on X or Twitter, if you prefer. It's a lot of fun right now because for those of you who don't know, the portal is still open until the 2nd of January. By the way, whose idea was it to make it the day after all the major bowl games? What idea was that? Why couldn't we make it to the 4th or 5th? Give them a little, for the guys that played in the bowl game or had a chance. Once again, very frustrating. But you can see my thoughts on stuff like that, among other things, on Twitter.
Yeah, no doubt about that. But Brian, once again, thanks for coming on to today's show. For all you Gamecock viewers and listeners, thank you for tuning in. Have a great rest of your Thursday, and I'll be sure to catch y'all on the next show of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast.